As we just heard, the news of the deaths in May 1760 in Helmholtz of both her closest companion and colleague, Anna Nitschmann, and the leader of the church, Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, Anna Seidel wrote in her memoir, what you just heard, the last paragraph, right? She writes, I just want to remind you, my anxious thoughts and premonitions about the future of the single sisters did unfortunately come true in considerable measure, and to my inexpressible pain, I had to witness that these dear people, Anna Nitschmann and Count Zinzendorf, were almost completely forgotten, especially the dear mama, Anna Nitschmann. Those sentences actually aren't in what you just heard being read, because they were scored through so heavily in the original that they were illegible. And so you had to actually go to Helmholtz to find another version of the memoir which had kept those lines in it. And so I wanted to give you that poignant quotation, not to retrace steps taken by other scholars before me, such as Beverly Smaby or Paul Poiker, but to show how and why the Moravian Church leadership after 1760 took such deliberate steps to dismantle female leadership in the church. It purged the archival record of any traces of that leadership. That passage is actually heavily scored out, as I said. So you saw this slide, and the last one sort of pointing forward to this one. What I'd like to talk about is how I've been working over the last year or so to rebuild a picture of Anna Nitschmann as a religious leader, and who in other times might not have had her legacy scrubbed away, literally, and her influence denied. In my work on Anna Nitschmann in Bethlehem last spring, I began this exploration. I looked at how Anna Nitschmann had been depicted in the kind of scholarship that exists on her to date, and I talked about how Anna Nitschmann's time in America changed both Zinzendorf's estimation of her abilities as a leader and led her to become elevated to being the mother of the church on their return from America. Until that point, Altmutter von Zinzendorf had been known as the mother of the church. I've also worked in great detail on how Anna's activities in America were quite extraordinary. I published an article in Germany on Anna Nitschmann in the Dictionary of Pietism, which actually caused the editor of that volume to write to me, and he said, "This is not what I was expecting, but it's wonderful," because what he was expecting was just a reiteration of what had already been said, all right, about Anna Nitschmann. So what I actually discovered in the archives in Bethlehem was, and also in London, and also in Yorkshire, so obviously the people who were out to destroy Anna Nitschmann's legacy didn't go as far as Yorkshire, was that she was quite an amazing woman, as we know. Anna Nitschmann was sent out to America with her father before Zinzendorf came here, and she was tasked with speaking to the disparate groups of Lutheran and Reformed emigrants here who Zinzendorf wished to unite in a vision of his Philadelphian church. She learned English within the space of a year, and we just heard how Anna Seidel did the same thing. Anna Peach learned English within the space of a year. Remember Anna Jungmann, whose memoir we heard earlier, she learned Mohican and Lenape languages very, very quickly as well. In Pennsylvania, Anna held conferences with Lutheran and separatist members, leaders of religious communities such as the Ephrata Cloister, the Dunkers, the Neumooners, the Schwenkfelders, and she actually lived with a Schwenkfelder in Faulkner's Swamp. Her presence attracted unmarried young women to listen to her speaking about Christ. She met the Lenni Lenape Indians, who lived around what was to become Nazareth, and once Zinzendorf and his party arrived in Philadelphia, she worked with all of these groups to attempt to secure the acceptance of Zinzendorf's plan. In the documents that I have found so far, I have found evidence that serves to contradict the traditional image of this extraordinary woman in Moravian history. Most often depicted as a shepherdess of souls or as the companion of Zinzendorf, almost never is she described as a female religious leader in her own right. The iconography of Anna Nitschmann is one laden with ribbons and flowers and little birds, hearkening back perhaps to the symbology of the sifting period. Scholarly comment on her recently discovered sermons to the single sisters remark on the importance of finding a woman's homilies to other women, but also tend to dismiss them as typically Moravian, nothing new, and derivative. Those of us who've worked in feminist scholarship for most of our careers recognize those terms as ones that a male-dominated critical discourse has traditionally used to dismiss women's contributions to art, literature, science, music, engineering, and religion. And believe me, it still goes on today. Whereas the leaders of the post-Zinzendorfian church may have used as an excuse the need to improve the Moravian church, the image of the Moravian church to its contemporaries, which is the argument that Beverly Smaby makes in her work, what is today's church's excuse? Why, when the Moravian church has ordained women bishops for 20 years, is there no mention of the woman who preceded them all, or indeed the women who preceded them all? And so here's a list of some of the very important women that I'm hoping to look at. You can probably tell my voice is going. Yeah, I knew this would happen. It does when I've spoken for too long, so I'll keep going as best I can. All right.
But Anna Nitschmann died much younger than any of the rest of them on that list.
Well, she had a rough life.
They were in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and she was only 45.
Yes. So we'll maybe find out about why she died so early. The picture I'm trying to find, I unfortunately can't find on my computer, but never mind. Anna Nitschmann's contemporaries thought very differently of her than the people who came after her. There is a beautiful collective picture of her life that was presented to her on the occasion of her 30th birthday that shows 18 different scenes of her life up to that point, and that are clearly considered to be iconic of the life of a single sister. And at that point in 1745, when the picture was presented to her, she was considered to be the mother of the church. We see Anna's childhood, where she is still in Moravia, working as a shepherdess for her father. We see her walking through the forests of Moravia as she is going towards Helmhut. We see her being received by Countess Henrietta von Gersdorf. We see her living in Berthelsdorf as a servant. That's why she was taken in to Berthelsdorf. She's supposed to be taking care of Benigna von Zinzendorf. There's a picture of her warming Benigna's soup by the fire. She meets with the women in Helmhut. She's introduced to the Moravian sisters by Altmutter in 1727. And then, of course, we know that she started the group of single sisters in 1728. And in 1730, she's elected to become the eldress of all the single sisters by Altmutter von Zinzendorf. One of the most striking pictures, and I'll have a look and see if I can find it easily, is one of Anna at the spinning wheel. It's supposedly 1735. She's sitting at the spinning wheel, and behind her is a loom, and there's somebody sitting at the loom. This is not unusual, of course, for Silesia and Moravia. Most of the people there, the artisans, were weavers and spinners, so the fact that Anna is sitting at a spinning wheel is not at all surprising. However, what is surprising is who is visiting her as she is at the spinning wheel. It is Zinzendorf and three theologians, Leiritz, Steinhofer, and Oettinger. And it's very important that these three theologians with Zinzendorf are standing in front of her while she is spinning wool. This picture continues with images of Anna traveling with Altmutter von Zinzendorf to London, visiting Zinzendorf's Zinzendorf's mother in Berlin, saying goodbye to the single sisters in Marienborn in 1740 on her departure for America. And what's very cute about the picture is all the single sisters have sort of got little handkerchiefs out and going, she's never going to come back. Right, it's very, very cute. And then we see Anna preaching. It's a very famous picture of Anna preaching to both male and female Quakers. There is debate as to whether or not this is a depiction of a preaching that happened in Philadelphia or in London. It could have happened either place, all right? And then the final picture is this sort of wonderful rewriting of history with Zinzendorf and Anna meeting in the middle of a Pennsylvanian forest in 1741. At the bottom of the picture, we see Anna being admired by a group of non-Europeans, sort of angels holding the picture. The exquisite artwork reveals to me not only the esteem in which Anna Nitschmann was held by her choir, but also the events of her life to date that caused them to hold her in that esteem. So if we're talking about agency and we're talking about what women did, it's very important to see what she did. Her simple beginnings, her flight to Herrnhut at the age of 10, her election at the tender age of 14 to the office of Eldress, her closeness to the aristocratic Zinzendorf family, the fact that she is visited repeatedly by leading church figures, her preaching to both men and women, and her bravery in the mission field are all events that obviously mean an enormous amount to the single sisters who presented her with this picture. What I'd like to point to is that Anna Nitschmann in 1735, between 1735 and 1742, while she's still in her 20s, displays exactly those characteristics of a leader of the church, as a leader of women and as a religious leader, that other religious leaders, women religious leaders in the Western Church have also shown. Figures you may have heard of, like Hildegard von Bingen, Mechthild von Magdeburg, the 17th century Madame de Guyon. And there is evidence that Anna Nitschmann studied these medieval mystics and later pietist thinkers before she left Herrnhut with the Zinzendorf family. She was in fact visited and corresponded with those leading figures of pietism that I named earlier. And for over 2 years they wrote to Anna Nitschmann between 1735 and 1737 discussing pietism, discussing mysticism. So not only was she visited by these high-standing men, she corresponded with them. And so rather than look at an image of Anna Nitschmann at the spinning wheel in the presence of these men as some kind of visual translation of the trope of the visitation of the Magi to Christ, maybe we could reinterpret that moment as a pivotal one in Anna's life. Because after that meeting, and in Anna's own Lebenslauf, which she wrote very young, after that meeting, Anna Nitschmann considered taking the path of contemplation and seclusion, but was persuaded by Zinzendorf to take the path of Christian action in the world instead. And I think this is really important, again, in the light of what we've been talking about in terms of memoirs and agency, that Anna Nitschmann chooses, or is persuaded by Zinzendorf, not to become a recluse who is writing about her spiritual visions of Christ, but actually to go out in the world and be an agent in the world.